A hospital visit reveals medieval secrets hidden in books. Using CT scanning on 16th century books, researchers uncovered bits of parchment salvaged from handwritten manuscripts. Even in medieval times, recycling was in vogue. Bits of parchment salvaged from older handwritten manuscripts were often used to reinforce other books. Using CT scanning, a team of researchers has now shown that those medieval leftovers hidden beneath some books' covers can be seen. Studying these medieval binding fragments can help reveal how, when and where early books were assembled, and there's always the tantalizing possibility of finding a previously unknown manuscript. In Europe, books were reproduced by hand up until the middle of the 15th century. Known as manuscripts, the Latin root manu means hand. Those written records were often works of art in their own right, with multiple colors of ink flowing across meticulously prepared sheets of calf, goat or sheepskin. However, with the printing press becoming common in Europe in the 1450s, there wasn't much of a need for such manuscripts, but some bookbinders opted to reuse their parchment pages. They could use the older, more durable manuscript to help reinforce the structure of a new printed book, said Eric Ensley, the curator of rare books and maps at the University of Iowa. Binders would cut pieces of parchment, sometimes full pages, sometimes just thin strips, and glue them on places like a book's spine. The book would then be covered, and most of those binding fragments would be hidden from view. There's actually a whole library within a library in the form of these fragments, said Joris Dick, a materials scientist who studies binding fragments at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands and was not involved in the new study. In recent decades, researchers have begun peering beneath book covers using non-invasive techniques to find medieval binding fragments and read what's written on them. But many of those techniques have limitations, which prompted Dr. Ensley and his colleagues to try CT scanning, the same kind available in a hospital. The technique's three-dimensional view solves the focus problems that plagued other methods, and a scan can be completed in seconds rather than the hours previously required. The team scanned a 3-book set of Historia Animalium and Encyclopedia of Animals printed in the 16th century. One book would serve as a control, the researchers decided, because its cover was damaged and could be peeled back to reveal medieval binding fragments, featuring red and black ink on the spine. The other 2 books were intact. However, the researchers hypothesized that their spines might also contain fragments because the books appeared to have been bound in the same workshop, said Catherine H. Taschow, a historian at the University of Iowa and a member of the research team. Under the watchful eye of Giselle Simon, the conservator at the University of Iowa Libraries, the team placed the 3 books on the bed of a CT scanner in the lab of Eric Hoffman at the university's Carver College of Medicine. The books fit with room to spare, and scanning all 3 took under a minute. With Dr. Taschow, Dr. Ensley watched the hidden text of some of the binding fragments being revealed on the scanner's screen. We both leaned in and started reading the Latin together, he said. It was a goosebumps moment. Many of the medieval binding fragments in the Historia Animalium came from a Latin Bible dating to the 11th or 12th century, the team reported in April in the journal Heritage Science. When the researchers analyzed the CT scans of their control book, they found that letters written in red ink were most pronounced in the images. Darker inks, however, did not show up as clearly. The different chemicals in the inks affect how they absorb X-rays, but by varying the energy of X-rays emitted by a CT scanner, it might be possible to better detect black inks in future studies, Dr. Ensley and his collaborators hypothesize. The fragments the team uncovered will be ultimately digitized in Fragmentarium, an online repository of more than 4,500 medieval binding fragments. The archive is a way to disseminate the information contained in these hidden pieces of history, said William Duba, a historian at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland who coordinates Fragmentarium. The spines of books are hiding treasures, he said. Fragment of lost 12th century epic poem found in another book's binding. This article is more than 1 year old. Scholars knew the work about Guillaume d'Orange and the bloody siege of his city existed, but until now believed it had been lost completely. A fragment from a 12th century French poem previously believed to have been lost forever has been found by an academic in Oxford's Bodleian Library. Dr. Tamara Atkin from Queen Mary University of London was researching the reuse of books during the 16th century when she came across the fragment from the hitherto lost CGD Orange in the binding of a book published in 1528. Parchment and paper were expensive at the time, and unwanted manuscripts and books were frequently recycled. Scholars had believed the poem, which comes from a cycle of chansons digest epic narrative poems about Guillaume d'Orange, existed, but there had previously been no physical evidence that this was true. The fragment only runs to 47 lines, but it proves the existence of a poem thought to have been completely lost. The poem is set in the 9th century, during the reign of Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son and heir. Atkin said that while it is believed to have been composed in the late 12th century, the fragment itself is from a copy made in England in the late 13th century. Illy demand comment southeast continent ill. Mausmently Queens Bertram ad dit ton frere en adni pain ni bol ni vin garrison nul don't il puis grier mais qui di sangli laissy plein bossin runs an early section of the fragment, which Philip Bennett, an expert on Guillaume d'Orange from the University of Edinburgh, has translated as, he asks him, how goes it with him? Badly, said Count Bertram. Your brother has neither bread nor corn nor wine. He has no supplies with which to save himself, except for one basinful of blood, which I left him. The quoted lines come as Bertram begs the king for help relieving the siege of Orange, a city in the Rhne Valley, describing the dire siege conditions. In later parts of the fragment we hear him berating the queen. At one point he even calls her Putrus or red-headed whore, who has objected to her husband leading a relieving army south, said Atkin. Atkin also found a parchment fragment from Biral's Roman de Tristan, telling part of the story of Tristan and Iseult in the same book. The 12th century poem is one of the earliest versions of the medieval romance, and until now the only evidence of its existence had been an incomplete 13th century manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The fragment found by Atkin differs significantly from the manuscript, and shows the poem was circulated more widely than had previously been thought. When you find manuscript waste in a 16th century book, it tends to be in Latin, and it's almost always something theological or philosophical, and from the point of view of modern-day literary scholarship, perhaps not that interesting. But the fragments in this book were different, said Atkin. They were in French, they were in verse, and in one of the fragments the name Iseult immediately jumped out. I'm not a French scholar, and I realized I was going to need to bring in some collaborators. From there, it's just been really fun and exciting. She approached academics from the universities of Bristol, Edinburgh and British Columbia to help. I knew it was something important, said J.R. Madison, a French manuscript specialist from the University of British Columbia who helped to identify the Tristan and Iseult fragment. This piece of the poem comes from a significant moment when Iseult speaks with her husband King Mark. This fragment expands our knowledge of the poem's audiences and its changing meaning over time and contributes a new perspective on how Tristan legends moved across Europe. Bennett said there had been no physical trace of the CGD Orange poem before. There is much evidence from other chansons digest that a poem about the siege Guillaume d'Orange suffered in his newly conquered city must have once existed, he said. The discovery of the fragment we now have fills an important gap in the poetic biography of the epic hero. This is a most exciting addition to the corpus of medieval French epic poetry. The team will now work to discover more about when and where the fragments were copied, and how they came to be bound in the 1528 book. That manuscripts were made at all reflects the value once placed on the texts they contain. But manuscripts that were dismembered and reused as waste were no longer valued as texts. Their only value was as a material commodity, parchment, that could be used to reinforce the binding of another book. The manuscripts containing these French poems were probably recycled because the texts were considered old-fashioned and the language outdated, said Atkin. It's fantastically exciting to discover something that's been lost all this time, but I do think it is also worth simultaneously holding the thought that actually, the only reason these fragments have survived is because at some point, someone thought the manuscripts in which they appeared were not valuable as anything other than waste. There's a sort of lovely tension in that, I think. As 2023 gathers pace and you are joining us from Russia, we have a small favor to ask. We are living through turbulent times, but the Guardian is always there, providing clarity and fear.